Of all roller coasters found around the world, no more have been built by Dutch manufacturer Vekoma. This is a massive accomplishment since the company is only 45 years old, and they've done so by averaging nearly 10 new coasters a year. This company has truly gone from the bottom to the tip top of the amusement industry, and their story is much more complicated than you may think. If you've seen my Intamin video, this will be much different, as Vekoma has installed nearly twice as many coasters, and unlike Intamin, most of these installations are cloned layouts. So as we go forward, many of the repeated layouts will be glanced over, but still, every coaster built will be mentioned. While starting the same year as Intamin, Vekoma would hit the ground running with a much larger slate of roller coasters. This was thanks to Aero Development, who was at their peak of power in the late 70s. After developing the tubular steel track and perfecting the mine train coaster, Aero would take home another record as the manufacturer to pull off the first successful inversions with their corkscrew coasters in 1975. While growing to build 20 inverting coasters by 1978, their production couldn't handle the global demand their hot product was generating. To remedy this, Aero would contact the small Dutch equipment manufacturer Vekoma to be their broker for all coasters in Europe. Aero would even travel to the Netherlands for months to teach Vekoma all their knowledge of track, train, and ride manufacturing. Vekoma would take this information and add their Dutch engineering to deviate from Aero's more stubborn continual radius design. After debuting their first model at the Anakermis Fair, Vekoma would open 3 in-park coasters with the same layout, known as the corkscrew with Bayern curve. While featuring the same height and speed on nearly the same footprint as Aero's corkscrew coasters, this model would shockingly be twice as long by performing a second lap around the layout with the titular Bayern curve, a helix-like element. These 3 would all open in Western Europe, with Super Warble at Holiday Park, Tornado at Walibi Belgium, and Super Spiral at Trommeland Park, which was the traveling coaster built the year before. While Europeans had just been exposed to this and Schwarzkopf's first loop the year before, these inverting coasters would take off just as they had in America, and began Vekoma on a huge trajectory. This would continue into the next year, where 2 more Bayern curve corkscrews would open, with probably the most famous at the UK's Alton Towers and the first outside of Europe at Argentina's Ital Park. After a 6th Bayern curve corkscrew at La Ronde named Super Menage, 1981 would see the debut of 3 other coasters, all with new layouts. 2 of these would debut as a new model called the Whirlwind. This would be a much smaller alternative to the Bayern curve, with much smaller stats, but still managed to pack in 2 inversions, with a drop directly into a corkscrew, a turn, and another corkscrew before ending the ride. This would begin a common trend for Vekoma, as like Aero, they would master the basics of a model and then use that to create many new layouts, based on what they called the MK1200 design. Also opening would be their largest coaster yet, Python at Efteling. Matching Aero for the most inversions on a coaster with 4, this double loop and corkscrew would do exactly that, with an almost identical layout to Aero's Carolina Cyclone, which had opened the year before. The new Whirlwind model would be popular enough to receive 2 more installations in 1982, with one being Whirlwind at Bobbejaanland and Corkscrew at Thailand's Magic Land. The first 5 years of Vekoma would be pretty standard, with 1983 seeing 5 more coasters with similar layouts to years before, starting with another Bayern curve named Corkscrew at Spanish City Amusement Park. The Whirlwind would see 2 more models as well, with Montanha Especial at Brazil's Tivoli Park and Whirlwind at the UK's Clacton Pier. The final two would be two more double loop and corkscrews, but having slightly different layouts. Montagna Russa at Diverland would be the standard cloned layout of Python, but Big Loop at Heidi Park would feature a slightly modified layout, with more straight track and an elevated section before the helix at the end. This distinction would technically make this Vekoma's first coaster with a custom layout, and mirrored the layout of Arrow's Dragon Fire, which had opened 2 years before. After essentially being an extension to Arrow for their existence, with nearly identical trains and layouts, Vekoma would have their first breakout year in 1984, with a brand new model and new trains. After their first coaster in the United States with another whirlwind at Rye Playland, Vekoma would debut their first shuttle coaster layout. Arrow and Schwarzkopf had debuted their shuttle coasters in 1977, and while using different methods, they would both launch into a loop and fall back to complete the full layout in reverse. Instead of a launch and one loop, Vekoma's new model, which they called the Boomerang, would begin by being hoisted backwards up an inclined spike. After reaching the top, the train would release and fly through the station into a brand new element Vekoma would call the Cobra Roll. This element would soar upwards into a Sidewinder-like inversion, but then level out and do the same inversion in reverse to turn the train back the other way. After that, the coaster would soar through a loop and then up another inclined spike and be winched up. After reaching the top, the train would fall backwards again and complete the layout in reverse before returning to the station. By completing the layout twice, the coaster would actually complete a record-breaking 6 inversions in a super compact footprint. This revolutionary design would be massively popular upon debut, with 4 debuting in different countries around the world this year. 3 would open simply named Boomerang at Bellewaerde Park, Rafael Padilla, and La Ronde, and one named Sea Serpent at Maurice Piers. Some of these coasters would also open with a new shaped train from Vekoma, featuring the same frame and chassis as Arrow's, but with a slightly more rounded shape. These new trains and slightly modified track, as well as opening coasters in every country in North America, would be Vekoma's statement to become their own distinct manufacturer from Arrow, and would begin to majorly affect the roller coaster industry as a whole. After building a new groundbreaking model, Vekoma would build their last original Bayern Curve with Screamer at Boblo Island, as well as another double loop and corkscrew with Shaman at Gardaland. The Boomerang would continue to grow, with Vekoma's first coaster in China at Star Lake Amusement Park and another at Tivoli Land, as well as Cobra at West Midlands Safari Park. Finally, Vekoma would build their most unique and first non-inverting coaster at Austria's Vienna Prater that would also be their smallest yet. The Wild Mouse model, which was populated all over through the 60s, were made up of the classic wooden model, the massively popular but tiny BA Shift model, and the growing Togo-built model at this time. Vekoma would use a brand new track style and a 4-person car to travel one of the largest Wild Mouse layouts around for the time. The ride would begin with a wonky tilted lift hill before completing a hairpin turn filled layout with a few large drops in between. This ride, named Speedy Gonzales with 3 E's, would be the only Wild Mouse coaster Vekoma would ever produce, but the larger modernized layout with large drops would inspire many manufacturers years later. Vekoma would have another big year in 1986, with 4 coasters, starting with another Boomerang named Tidal Wave at Trimper Rides. This would be followed with the introduction of another compact inverting model called the Tornado. This would stand slightly taller and faster than the Whirlwind, but essentially be the same layout, but replacing the first corkscrew with a vertical loop. This coaster, named after the model, would open at Tokyo Summerland and operate until a couple years ago. The final 2 coasters would be 2 more with custom layouts, and actually be Arrow coasters that Vekoma would complete due to Arrow's bankruptcy at the time. The first would be a large coaster made for Expo 86 in Vancouver, named Scream Machine. The coaster would climb over 100 feet and turn into a small drop directly into a loop and a sidewinder, an element that would begin as a loop but would then turn out at the top, which Arrow had created a few years before. The ride would then drop into a double corkscrew and low-to-the-ground helix before returning to the station. The second, and much more interesting, is the well-named Crazy Roller Coaster at Nanhu Amusement Park in China. This terrain-based ride would begin with one of the most diabolical first drops you'll ever see, wildly banking and diving down the hill before rising into two hang-time-filled corkscrews. The coaster would then charge over a bunny hill and into a first-of-its-kind element, the reverse sidewinder. This would be exactly what it sounds like, with the sidewinder being taken in the opposite direction to be a dive loop-like element, followed by a loop and a helix to end the ride. If this ride tracked well, this could have been one of the best steel coasters ever made to that point, as the awesome terrain created one of the most unique layouts ever seen for the time. "1987 would begin fairly standard with 3 more boomerangs at Butlins and Zygopolis, as well as Bat at Canada's Wonderland, but would also see the introduction of a new model. Arrow had introduced their revolutionary suspended coaster earlier in the 80s, which they would improve greatly through the decade, and Vekoma, as Arrow's copycat at the time, wanted a piece of the pie. This model, which they called the Swinging Turns, would use nearly identical track and trains to Arrow's coasters and fit a very small footprint. Debuting as Air Race at Bobbejaanland, the airplane-themed trains would take a simple but scenic layout over water with winding left and right turns before a large drop before the brakes. The next year would be Vekoma's biggest yet, with 9 coasters and new models introduced. A fourth and final double loop and corkscrew would open as Mira Looping at Miropolis, as well as the incredibly popular boomerang seeing 3 more models around the world. At Avenirland, Titan at World Expo Park, and Coca-Cola Roller at the Glasgow Garden Festival. Lupin would open at Tussenfried as another tornado, and Centrifuge would also open at World Expo Park as another Swinging Turns, with the same layout of Air Race. That wasn't all for World Expo Park though, as the park would receive a third coaster from Vekoma as one of their new models for the year. Being their first indoor coaster, this would open with a brand new track style and simple 2-row, 2-wide trains with lap bars. 2 of these would open with a space theme, certainly trying to use the aesthetic of Disney's world-famous Space Mountain. Supernova would be a simple layout with a seemingly endless right turn, but Space Center at Phantasialand would feature a far more ambitious layout. By far the longest coaster Vekoma had built at the time, and would be for years, the indoor coaster would use 3 lifts to travel over 3,800 feet of track and glide through many turns and small drops. Along with these custom MK900 coasters, Vekoma would debut a smaller train model with the custom MK700. This would feature a single-car train that would seat 2 riders in lap-sitting style and open as Nightmare at Boblo Island. This would be similar to Supernova, taking a long right turn to snake down a short layout before sliding into the brakes. After their biggest year in 1988, Vekoma would match their 9 coasters again, but this time with an even more impressive lineup. After another boomerang in Flashback at Six Flags Over Texas, a third natural disaster named model would be introduced with the Hurricane. A more appropriate name for this model would have been the Single Loop and Corkscrew, as the coaster did just that, as well as a helix before returning to the station. This would be Comet Space at Big Bang Schroetumpf, and would be followed by 3 more MK1200 coasters, each having custom layouts. The smallest would be the still impressive French Revolution at Lotte World, and while only featuring one loop, it would still fly through a compact, fully indoor layout with a picturesque helix at the end. The next would be the compact Kamikaze at Konko's Party Pier, which featured 5 inversions including a reverse sidewinder, a double corkscrew, and a brand new inversion known as a butterfly. This would essentially be 2 loops joined at the valley for a very intense double inversion. The butterfly would only be featured on 2 coasters, Kamikaze and Vekoma's biggest coaster of the year, Guderiks at Park Asterix. After Aero had beaten the inversion record over the years, Vekoma would match the record of 7 that had been achieved the year before. After dropping into the butterfly, the train would fly into a batwing, a first for Vekoma, which would essentially be a dive loop followed by an Immelman-type maneuver to turn the train around, before a loop and a double corkscrew. After all these inverting coasters, Vekoma would also flesh out their smaller models as well, with another MK900 model, again at Lotte World, named Londonderry Express. This would be outdoors, and easily be Vekoma's smallest and tamest coaster yet, with only a few tiny dips and turns. The MK700 would see another installation as well, with the simply named Roller at Tele-Coup. This hillside coaster would snake through the woods with a long 12-car train in a well-paced layout. This 12-car train would be nothing compared to the second version of the MK700 that would debut this year, with 2 coasters in a one-off model known as the Illusion. You'll think you're seeing an illusion the first time you see these trains too, as Revolution at Bobillon Land would feature a 30-car, 60-passenger train, and Chaos at Opryland would feature an even more ridiculous 40-car, 80-passenger train. This insanely long vehicle would have an expectedly limited layout, winding up a super extended spiraling tire lift before some small dips. While certainly an odd experiment, I always appreciate hypercapacity focused rides, and the unique experience made this a noteworthy model.